Hey guys, Tammy here, and in this video, we're going to talk about never use the N-word. Now, I know the N-word means one thing to a lot of people, but the N-word in what I do and what I see every day is, of course, narcissist. But as most of you know, as soon as that word leaves your mouth, you've, lost half the battle because people just are not responsive to that in the court system, at least. So we're going to talk about why that is. We're going to talk about what you can do instead of using that word to try to get your points across. Okay. Before we dive into this topic, let me just remind you, as always, if you like this content, find it helpful, don't forget to hit like on the video and also subscribe to the channel so that you get notified as new videos are released. And as always, please feel free to share on social media so we can help more people, reach more people that are dealing with a narcissistic ex on custody. This particular video, I think, is kind of more specific to the custody world. But, a lot of times we're dealing with narcissistic people in our jobs, in our families, in whatever. And so these techniques can really apply across the board that we talk about a lot of times. Now, when we're dealing with people in the court system and we start using the word narcissist, what I always tell people is the first thing that's going to do with whether you're dealing with an expert, you're talking about an evaluator, some kind of therapist, an attorney for the children, or even your judge, in the courtroom. As soon as that word leaves your mouth, I think the first thing that pops into most of those experts' mind is, well, you're not an expert to be able to diagnose that person. So, you definitely don't want to say, oh, they're a narcissist. I would describe it more as narcissistic traits so that you're using it as an adjective, but still I wouldn't use the word at all if possible. But as soon as that leaves your mouth, it's kind of like, well, you're not an expert. You're not a therapist. And, sometimes even if you are an expert, the other side will argue, well, you're too emotionally close to this situation to be able to objectively diagnose and all that kind of thing. So there's just a lot of problems on the diagnosis part of it. And I think that we deal with many people that have narcissistic traits, even if they're not people that would necessarily be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, per the, psychiatric diagnosis of it, so to speak. But it doesn't mean that those narcissistic behaviors aren't problematic. And it doesn't mean that there aren't specific ways that you have to handle it just because it wouldn't be a diagnosis, right? So that's kind of the first part of it. I think the second thing that happens is as soon as we say, oh, the other person is narcissistic, well, the first thing is, well, what's wrong with you? What's your problem that you're throwing that out about the other person? It's interesting because I had a conversation with a therapist several months ago, and we were talking about this dynamic, and this therapist doesn't work in custody or the courts or anything like that. But it just does like family therapy. And we were having this conversation, and I kind of threw out there, I always tell clients that as soon as you say the word narcissist, they start wondering what's wrong with you. And that therapist stopped and they said, that's actually true. That's the first thing that pops in my mind when I have a client come in, a patient come in, and they start describing their partner as narcissistic or a narcissist. I automatically go, what's wrong with this person that they're blaming the other person's behavior for things? So some of this is just sort of like human psychology type reactions, just kind of our default reactions to things, which honestly would be nice if it wasn't there, right? But we're human beings and we all have our biases. And so I think that for most people, as soon as you throw that word out there, they've got some bias trying to figure out what your role in it is. Because let's face it, I mean, if we've been in a relationship with a narcissist and we've been in these toxic relationships, we have our own side of the street to clean up, right? And so that's usually where you're starting when you go into a therapist. It's like, if you're going in and you're saying, oh, the problem is my partner is a narcissist or is narcissistic, then the first thing for that therapist is, well, you're not taking responsibility for whatever your part in that is because you can't change the other person, right? And I think the court has that same kind of default attitude of, well, fix your own things before you start casting judgment on the other person. I think it's real important to just understand that and understand when you're approaching it that certain ways you present and certain things that you say can already kind of put that person in judgment of you. And so then you've got an uphill battle, right? Then you're having to work against that sort of prejudice that they've developed because of the way that you've presented it. And now you're having to work even harder to get your point across. So it can make things difficult just in the way you present things. I always say to people, it's not what you're saying, it's how you're saying it, right? That's the big thing. And then I think that the next piece of it is we have to understand that from just a sheer behavior perspective, the court in a lot of ways doesn't care about the behavior of either party. And when I say doesn't care, I don't mean from like a human perspective. A lot of people that I talk to will just be like, oh, my judge doesn't care. Nobody cares. Nobody cares this is happening. Well, it's not that they don't care as a human being. It's just that it doesn't reach the level of concern that it needs to for the court to have the justification for implementing certain orders. So when we're talking about those behaviors from the other person, it's not necessarily about how they behave so much as it's about how does their behavior impact the children. And that's the big piece on a custody case in particular. How are these behaviors impacting the children? That's really what you want to focus on. And again, it still has to rise to a certain level, right? And I find that as kids age and go through this and start to find their own voice and learn to stand up for themselves and things, a lot of this stuff will come to light more and more, especially if you have a child in with a good therapist and things of that nature. But what happens is that we become very focused on look what the other person is doing. And of course, the impact of that is the effect on us, the effect on the kids, all of those kinds of things. But when you're presenting it in a way that says, look at what this other person's doing, I think in our mind, we kind of assume, oh, well, look at what the other person's doing. And then we assume that the court will be like, oh, yeah, therefore this probably impacts the kids. We kind of go about it backwards where we're talking about the other person's behavior and we're assuming that the court is drawing the line to the impact on the children. But what you have to do is actually the reverse. You have to draw the first line of the impact on the children, then let the court come to the conclusion that the behavior is problematic, if that makes sense. Let's say that you've got somebody who's very argumentative and won't ever reach agreement with you on doctors, dentists, schooling, or they delay, or they don't respond, or you send them names of providers and, you don't hear anything for a month and all of that. Well, you can go into court asking for full legal or for tie-breaking authority. But if you're presenting that in, oh, the other parent doesn't respond to me, they delay, it's frustrating, I send names of providers, I ask questions, they're not responding, they're doing all these things. That doesn't really impact the court in the same way as if you say, look, I send questions, I send potential providers, I send all these things, I don't get a response. And what happens is the child's care is delayed. For instance, the child had a cavity. I got no response for 6 weeks. By the time I took the child back to the dentist, it had turned into a root canal for the child because we delayed so long on the cavity issue, right? Something along those lines. So that, and I'm saying we delayed on the issue, right? I'm not saying the other parent didn't respond, so the child didn't get, like, if you're saying that it was delayed, the court's going to figure out that it was the other parent. But you're staying focused on the fact of what this resulted in for the child. And that's what they really care about. That's what they're really focused on, is what did this situation, how did it have a negative impact on the child or them receiving care or whatever. You want to really start to frame things in terms of not just the behavior of the narcissistic person, because I think we're really, when you start getting into this and doing research about this particular disorder, you understand in the custody realm that you need to describe behavior. But I think you have to take it a step further and think about, how does that behavior impact the children? And that's really the path that you want to lead the court down, as opposed to throwing out the term narcissist or saying why they're so problematic. Okay, so if you find this content helpful and you'd like to learn more about my coaching services, you can go to divorceuniversityonline.com/VIP-coaching. There's a link on that page. You can book a time to speak with a member of my staff, learn more about my services and how I might be able to help you on your custody journey. See you guys next time.
We'll grow in number, fueled by them to see the horizon, turn us to thousands.